The year before the 70th week of Daniel begins will be a Shmita year. In the Bible, this type of year is marked by the stopping of commerce. Now, a new Jewish religious year is starting this week, and look what's happening all around us. An international shutdown of commerce because of the coronavirus. Watch this video for a fascinating look at whether we could be entering a Shmita year. Maybe it's the Shmita year and the year before the Tribulation. Shmita years or sabbatical years were commanded by God as a time when commerce was to stop. Is that what's happening now? Is God stopping commerce so as to enforce his Shmita upon the world as a sign of a coming tribulation? Well, before we answer that very important question, I bet you're asking, wait a minute, isn't this date setting like Harold Camping did back in 2011? No, not at all. Let us explain. The first aspect is we aren't saying this is the tribulation ready to start. We are saying it might be a sign of it starting. And we are absolutely to watch for signs. Jesus and Paul told us 30 times in the New Testament to watch. And that is what we're doing, watching. Second, Jesus told us that we cannot know the day or hour. But he never told us we can't know the year or month. Now, you might have a hard time with that distinction, but look closely at Jesus' exact words. But of that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. We don't need to add to what Jesus had to say. And third, and absolutely most importantly, let us show you something else that you probably haven't noticed before. Jesus said, but of that day and hour, no one knows. Jesus called it that day. And it's only that day that we cannot know. Grammatically, using the term that day, it has to be a day that Jesus mentioned previously in his sermon on the Mount of Olives. It cannot be a day he did not mention. This is a hugely misunderstood point. So, if it was a day that Jesus spoke of, what day was it? What was the most significant day that Jesus mentioned in Matthew 24? And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. That day is the day the sun, the moon darken, and when Jesus comes on the clouds. That is the day Jesus said we could not know. It's not a pre-trib rapture or a post-trib rapture because he didn't mention those things in Matthew 24. And it's not the first day of the 70th week of Daniel either because he didn't mention that. So in this video, we aren't predicting a start of the tribulation. We are saying this could be it. This could be a sign of it. That's all we're saying. And signs are worth investigating. This idea was put forth by a member of our community with the handle, Do It Well. And I think it's brilliant and well worth looking at. Now it is an amazing coincidence that a Jewish religious year is beginning on March 26th. At the same time, businesses around the globe are shutting down. This has never happened in history. Is it God who is enforcing his final Shmita year on the world before the tribulation? And there is precedent for this. God has done this kind of thing before and written about it in the Bible. We'll talk about that shortly. But maybe you're wondering what a Shmita year is. So let's start by examining it because it's a pretty strange term. In fact, it's an ancient Hebrew term. In our modern society, we divide years into decades of 10 years and centuries of 100 years. We even classify our music in terms of decades, music of the 70s, 80s, 90s, for instance. And centuries into the 1800s, 1900s, 2000s, etc. But ancient Hebrews were given a different system by God by which to classify their years. Instead of dividing the years into units of 10 and 100, they divided them into units of 7 and 49. And that just seems weird to our modern minds, but it shouldn't. We divide our days into units of 7 days a week. And the system God gave Israel for the years mirrors the 7 days of the week, 6 days of work and a Sabbath. When you come into the land which I shall give you, then the land shall have a Sabbath to the Lord. 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather its crop. But during the 7th year, the land shall have a Sabbath rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. So Israel was commanded to sow and reap and harvest for 6 years, but on every 7th year they were to stop their industry, which, of course, at that time was agricultural, and allow the land to rest. God promised to give them a double harvest in the 6th year to provide for them in the year they didn't sow or reap. This Sabbath year is called the Shmita year or sabbatical year, since it acts like a Sabbath. It is the Sabbath of years, just like the Sabbath day is the Sabbath of days. Now, just like a week is called a week, in the same way, this week of years is also called a week. 7 years make up a week of years. This should be sounding pretty familiar to you. Daniel's 70th week is one of those sabbatical cycles of years. It's a week of 7 years. And the final year of that week is the Shmita year, a year that is set aside to let the land rest and for God's people to rest. This is just like a Sabbath day being a day of rest. In each week of years on this graphic, there are 6 blue years of work followed by a green year of rest, followed by 6 more years of work, followed by another year of rest. Now, before we begin to look at whether this particular year, 2020, is a sabbatical year, let's first look back at the other time that God enforced his shemitah upon Israel and forced the land to rest. At that time, the rest was for 70 years. In the book of 2 Chronicles, we read, "Those who had escaped from the sword, he carried away to Babylon, and they were servants to him and to his sons until the rule of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. All the days of its desolation it kept Sabbath, until the 70 years were complete." Israel had neglected the sabbatical year, where the land was to lay fallow, since the days of Solomon, 490 total years. 70 sets of 7-year sabbatical cycles. Israel had disobeyed God's commandment to let the land enjoy its Sabbath. Instead, they planted and sowed and reaped every year. When God had had enough, he punished Israel by having King Nebuchadnezzar take them into exile for 70 years, the exact number of Sabbath years they had neglected. And while Israel was in bondage in Babylon, the land rested. God enforced his sabbatical years. So how does this apply to our world today? Well, just look around you. The world is shutting down. Schools, businesses, sporting teams. Most methods of commerce worldwide are taking a sabbatical. This is unprecedented in all of history. There has never been a shutdown of most worldwide commerce all at once, and all because of the coronavirus. Is the coronavirus God's means to enforce one final Shmita year on a world obsessed by money, work, and position, all before the tribulation? One shemitah as a wake-up call to get the world's attention before the tribulation begins. And trust me, it has gotten the whole world's attention. You probably agree that this is an event unlike anything you have ever seen. Yet you might ask, why does this channel say the year after the Shmita could be the tribulation? Where did we ever get that idea? Well, as we stated before, the 70th week of Daniel, or the tribulation, is a week of years. And these weeks proceed in unbroken fashion, one after another. Just like weeks of days, 6 years of work and then a Sabbath year. 6 years of work, then a Sabbath year of rest, on and on. So every new week of years is always preceded by a Shemitah year of rest. Logically then, the final 7-year week of years, or the tribulation, is also preceded by a Shemitah year. When the tribulation starts, the year prior to it will have been a Shemitah by definition. And if this year, 2020, is a Shemitah, it is a Shemitah unlike any other to date, shutting down not only the agricultural fields in Israel, but the entire world. At least for a month or so, and who knows how much longer. Now, the ancient Shemitah year is also a year of resetting, a year of the forgiveness of debts. At the end of every 7 years, you shall grant a remission of debts. This is the manner of the remission. Every creditor shall release what he has loaned to his neighbor. He shall not exact it upon his neighbor and his brother, because the Lord's remission has been proclaimed. If this truly is a Shemitah year, how will God accomplish this remission of debts? Possibly by crashing the stock markets and currencies of the world. There is a historic analogy here as well. In Germany, after World War I, the German mark, its currency, underwent a serious devaluation. The German Kaiser made 2 mistakes prior to the end of the war. First, he took the German mark off the gold standard, meaning it could fluctuate in value. And then second, he borrowed to pay for the war. Debt and going off the gold standard. Sound familiar? If not, we'll explain why it should in just a second. But back to what happened in Germany. The war left the nation saddled with massive war debts that it could not afford. A problem exacerbated by printing money to pay the debt. Now in 1921, 90 German marks equaled a US dollar. They were about a penny apiece. By 1923, it would take 1 trillion marks to equal a dollar. In 1921, a loaf of bread cost 160 marks. By the end of 1923, it cost 200 trillion marks. Crazy, absolutely crazy. You'd have to take your money to the store in a wheelbarrow. Although this totally wiped out people's life savings, it also wiped out their personal debt. Let's say you owed 20,000 US dollars on your home. That would be a very nice home in those days. After 1923, when the money devalued, that debt would be less than a price of a loaf of bread. Might the same devaluing of currency happen right now, wiping out all debt worldwide? Might superinflation be a way the nations try to pay for the time off work currently occurring? In my opinion, it is the only way they will be able to pay for it. Print more money. And 2 other fairly modern parallels to Germany are also eerily similar. In 1971, U.S. President Richard Nixon took the USA off the gold standard. And I don't have to tell you about the amount of debt the USA and other nations are in either. It is a perfect parallel to Germany after World War I. First, a killer pandemic. After World War I, that was the Spanish flu. And that was just ending, and then hyperinflation ruined their economy. Now, if history repeats itself, when might that take place? In Deuteronomy 15, we learn it is at the end of the 7 years that the remission of debt occurs. If this truly is a shemitah year, that would either be this September at the end of the secular year or next March, depending on whether the Hebrew shemitah should be secular or a religious year. Look what James has to say about our riches in the last days. Your gold and your silver have rusted, and their rust will be a witness against you and will consume your flesh like fire. It is in the last days that you have stored up your treasure. Jesus tells us to store up treasure in heaven, but our society has stored it up for these last days. Oh yes, and one other thing, maybe the most important thing. An ambitious man began to rise to power in Germany after the economic crash, promising that he had all the answers. His name, Adolf Hitler. So is this yet another lesson from history? Will the ultimate ambitious man rise to power in the near future promising that he has all the answers? The Antichrist. Only time will tell. So why are we saying the Shemitah might be this year, 2020? Jonathan Cahn, after all, has promoted the idea that the Shemitah was back in 2015. He predicted a crash that year. Of course, that crash never came. The Sanhedrin in Israel said it was in 2016. Perry Stone said 2017. Yet no one has been saying 2020 is a Shemitah year. But could they all be off by a few years? That's all it would take. So let's take a look. It all depends on what year Jesus was baptized. To which you are probably saying, wait a minute, what is this guy talking about? But here is what Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy has to say about the Shemitah and the coming of the Messiah, or Anointed One. So you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. Daniel explains to us that there would be 69 of these total weeks of 7 years each. Then the Messiah would come. So right after, or on a Shemitah, Jesus the Messiah would be revealed and anointed. Jesus was revealed and anointed at his baptism. Messiah means anointed one after all. If we know that year, we'd know the year of a Shemitah, at least within 1 year. Luke provides us with this year. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea. So in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, John came baptizing. This date was either AD 27 or AD 29, depending on whether you date it from the beginning of a joint reign that Tiberius held with his father Augustus Caesar, or at the beginning of his solo reign. So Jesus could have been baptized in AD 27, and if that was the Shemitah year, calculating all the way into the 21st century, 2020 would also be a Shemitah or sabbatical year. Wow! I'm sure you see that this is getting kind of interesting. This is confirmed by Jesus' statement in Nazareth when he read from the Isaiah scroll. And the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him, and he opened the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set free those who are oppressed, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord." This last term, year of the Lord, means the sabbatical year. Just like the day of the Lord means the Sabbath day. So Jesus is telling us it was a Shemitah year. 2020 then, being a potential shemitah, fits with history and with scriptures. And now it seems to fit with world events as the entire world is shutting down. The next question is, how can we test this theory? Well, unfortunately, we can't for several years. If this is the shemitah prior to the 7-year tribulation, we won't know until the sign that Jesus gave us. What is that sign, you might ask? A peace treaty? That's what I've heard. No, when asked about end times, Jesus never mentioned a peace treaty or a covenant. Here is what he did say. You'll be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place. But that is not yet the end. So Jesus said wars and rumors of wars aren't the end either. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. Jesus also tells us the struggles between nations, or better translated, people groups, earthquakes and famines, aren't the signs either. He said these are preliminary events. Jesus told us there is only one sign to look for. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. There is only one totally unique sign that we cannot mistake, and that is the Antichrist sitting in the temple of God in Jerusalem, proclaiming himself to be like God. That is the way we know we are really in the tribulation. We won't know it till that point. This event, the abomination of desolation, happens at the midpoint of a tribulation, after 3.5 years. And if 2020 truly is the shemitah year, the tribulation would probably start in September, and the midpoint would be around Passover of 2024. Now, we are not date setting these things. We are not picking that date. We are only estimating what it would be if we are correct. We won't know that we're correct until we see the sign of the abomination of desolation. And that would not happen for another 4 years. 2024 doesn't seem that far away. But if we are right, that is all the time we have left before the Great Tribulation. 4 years. 4 years to get ready. So how does one prepare for something like that? If you haven't seen it yet, we have a video, How to Prepare for the Last Days, the movie, in which we discuss how to prepare to overcome in the midst of all these types of things. How to be a servant of the Most High God during that difficult time. If you want to see that movie, click on the banner. We will also leave a link down in the description along with a link for our playlist on Daniel's 70th week and the Jubilee year. Now in our next episode, we'll discuss a topic a lot of you have been asking about, the coronavirus vaccine. Should we trust mandatory vaccinations? I've heard you ask, Nelson, what do we do if they force us to take a vaccine? Is it safe? To keep watching, well, click right here. Also be sure to subscribe and ring the bell notification to receive notices when videos just like this one are published. Till then, this is Nelson, and I'll see you there.